So writing loops. So why do we need loops in a programming language? So when you want to execute some code, right? So some logic repeatedly, right? Then you write a loop, right? You don't want to repeat the same code again and again. So for example, we had written a code to find the grade of students, right? If the mark is in a certain range. So if you remember that procedure that we wrote, so this one, right? So this is something that you might want to do for each and every student in the class. So if there are 10 students, right, for each student, we'll get the mark and then we have to execute the same code. So one option is, of course, to write it 10 times, right? Take the first mark of the student, execute this, then take the second student's mark, execute the same thing, right? So write the code again, then take the mark of the third student, right? And so on. So this is not very good solution, right? So writing the same thing again and again. So what we do, we put it inside a loop. Write it once, put it inside a loop, repeat the loop. Give me a minute, please. I'm sorry, let us see if I'm able to talk, otherwise. Okay, so so this is what we need a loop for, right? So this is the part of the code that we want to execute repeatedly, right? So for if there are 10 students, we want to execute it 10 times. If there are 20 students, you want to do it 20 times. So what you do, you take the code, put it inside a loop, and specify how many times you have to execute the loop, right? So this is why we need a loop in any programming language. So when it comes to MySQL, there are 3 ways of writing your loops, right? So we will start with a simple loop. And we'll start with a simple trivial task, right? So instead of doing a big calculation, let us say what we want to do repeatedly is to say hello, right? So I want to say hello as message. This is what I want to execute multiple times. So let's say I want to execute this 5 times or 3 times, right? So I want to say hello 3 times. One option, of course, I can type the same thing 3 times or say what I want to do and put this inside a loop. So how do we put it inside a loop? A loop needs a label, right? So let's say I call it my loop, colon, right? A loop. And then to end the loop, you will say end loop, my loop. Okay. So whatever you put within this loop and end loop will be executed multiple times. And don't think the moment you see end loop, you will, this loop is getting over. All it means is whatever is there between loop and end loop has to be executed multiple times. So whenever it sees end loop, it will go back to the beginning of the loop. Again, execute it. End loop says go back. Right. So this particular set of code will be executed indefinitely, right? Because we did not mention when to stop. Right. So we never told the loop when to stop. So this is called an indefinite loop or infinite loop. So as long as you keep your computer open, right? So this will keep running. It will keep saying hello, hello, hello. Right. So what we need to do is we need to decide how many times we want to execute it. Then we have to have a check for that. Right. Just a moment. So in order to keep track of how many times we have executed this, we will declare a local variable, right? So the purpose of the variable is to keep track of how many times we have done this, right? So usually it is called a counter variable. It's just a variable, nothing special about it, but we are using it to count, right? So count how many times the loop has been executed. So we'll declare a local variable. I hope you remember all about local variables and what was the other one? What are the two types of variables we saw?
Parameter and local variable.
Yeah. So I won't call it local. I'll just call it CNT. That is a kind of a convention to show that it's a counter variable. This is of type integer. And by default, we will give it a value 0. So that means we have a variable called CNT and it contains 0 inside it. Now we come into the loop. We say hello, right? So hello will be printed one time. Now to keep track that hello has been printed one time, we will increment the counter by 1. That means we will add 1 to whatever value is there in the counter and put it back into the counter variable. Right. So now CNT will contain 1. Earlier it was 0. We added 1 to it and we put it back into the same variable. So how do we do that? We'll say set the value of counter to be equal to the old value of counter plus. Right. So earlier, whatever value was there in the counter, add 1 to it and put it back into the counter variable. Right. So now this is 1. So this tells you that hello has been printed 1 time. Then you come here, go back, again say hello. Right. So hello will be printed for the 2nd time. Now what happens here? Whatever value is there in CNT, add 1 to it and put it back into CNT. So 1 is there in CNT, add 1 to it, put it back into the variable called CNT. Right? So CNT now contains 2. So this says hello has been printed 2 times. Right? Then again come back, come here. So again it will print hello. Increment your counter. Whatever value is there in CNT, right? Add 1 to it and put it back into the counter. Right? So CNT now contains 3. So we wanted to print hello 3 times. So whenever the counter becomes equal to 3, we have to stop the loop or we have to get out of the loop. Right? How do we do that? We will check if the value of counter, right? After setting the counter every time, we will check if the value of counter is equal to 3, then leave my loop. Right? And don't forget your end if. So when you see, when you say leave my loop, control will be taken out of the loop. Right? So it will not repeat it anymore. It will come out and it will continue with the rest of the statements. Right? So this is how you can write a simple loop. Let's write it, right? Then we will try it once again. I'll create a procedure. And call it simple underscore loop. Yeah. Now we have to declare a variable, right? So we'll say declare count, which is of type integer. And by default, put the value 0 inside it, right? So now let's start our loop. My loop, colon, loop, and end loop, my loop. So within this, we have to write what we need to do repeatedly, right? So what do we want to do? We want to print hello, right? So as soon as you print hello, you keep track of it, right? So we have to increment the counter. Set the value of counter to be equal to the old value of counter plus 1. Now check. If the value of counter is equal to 3, then leave my loop and end if. Okay, so that is it. This should execute, or this should print hello 3 times, right? So here, at this point, counter becomes 0. At this point, hello will be printed once. This will increment the counter to 1, right? So that means 1 time hello has been printed. Is the value of count equal to 3? No, this will not be executed. It will come here, which means go back to the beginning. Again, say hello. Change the counter. Counter now becomes 2. Is 2 equal to 3? No, right? This is not executed. Come here, go back, repeat it again. So hello. Increment the counter. Counter becomes 3. Is the value of counter equal to 3? Yes. Leave the loop. Right? So that is it. We have printed hello 3 times. Okay, so this is what we mean by a simple loop. Can you try this? Type it and see. Okay, let me first try it. So we will create this, apply, close, and what is it called? Simple underscore loop. Right, so call simple underscore loop. So it says hello 3 times, right? Try this. Any issues?
No, ma'am.
Done? Is that working?
Yes, ma'am.
I hope everyone else is able to do. Okay, so now what if you want to execute it any number of times? Here we have written for 3 specifically, right? But let us say we want to call, what is it called? A simple loop, right? So simple underscore loop of 5, it should print hello 5 times, right? If you say 4, this should print hello 4 times, right? So if you want it to be like changeable, if you want to control it while you're calling the procedure, right, you can pass that as a parameter. So here you can pass some number, right? So let's say number, integer, and instead of checking for 3, whatever number you are passing here, that many times we have to execute the loop, right? So this will make it like more flexible. So let's say number, integer, and here instead of checking for 3, let's check for number, right? So apply, close, and here, so call simple loop 2 times, it will print only 2 times. Right? If you call it 4 times, right, and if you want to print hello 5 times, right, so it prints 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right, 5 times it will print. So by passing it as a parameter, you can control how many times this loop is executed. Okay. Maybe you can quickly add this change. And then we can move on to other 2 types of loops. Are we fine with the logic?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Okay. So Shar says done. Okay, let us move on to the next type of loop, which is a repeat loop, right? So there are 3 ways of doing the same thing. It's okay if you understand one, right? If you understand the logic of one, the other 2 are the same. Whichever you find convenient, you can do that, right? So you can either use a repeat loop or you can use a while loop. So I'll show you how to use a repeat. So let's copy the same code so that we know where the changes are. Let's create this. I'll call it repeat underscore loop. Repeat. And let's copy this. Okay. So here, instead of loop and end loop, we will say repeat and end repeat. So this is a convention that is followed. Okay. If you have if, you end it with end if. Right. If you have a loop, you end it with end loop. If you have repeat, you end it with end repeat. If you have while, you end it with end while. Right. So this is a convention that is followed. So we are using the repeat loop. So end repeat, right? Here we don't have to specifically check this condition, right? Instead of this, what we will say is repeat these two lines of code until the value of count becomes equal to 3, right? So this is your repeat loop. Instead of checking if count is equal to 3 and leave the loop, we will say repeat these two lines of code until the value of count becomes equal to 3. When the value of count becomes equal to 3, you will stop executing this. Right. So this is what your repeat loop will look like. Everything else, the way it functions is the same. Right. It's just that the syntax is slightly different. So if you find this more intuitive, you can do that. Right. So here you can say call repeat underscore loop. So this will print hello 3 times. If you want to control this, integer, and instead of checking for 3, we will check for this number, right? So now apply this, apply, close, and so if you say 2, it will print 2 times. If you say 4, it will print 4 times, and so on. Okay. So the logic is the same. Only thing is the way you express it, right? So instead of writing if something is equal to, we say until this becomes equal to this, which is another way of saying the same thing, right? Until the value of count becomes equal to num, keep repeating these two lines of code, right? So that is your repeat loop. Same thing, one more way of writing is using the while loop, right? So although there are 3 ways, you can choose what is what you find more intuitive, right? That you can go ahead and use. Not a there is no need to remember all 3. Yeah, so I've copied the same code. Again, here you don't need the if condition, right? Here instead of loop, we will say while. Here end loop, we'll say end while. And now we'll say while the value of count remains less than 3, do these 2 lines, right? So as long as the value of count is less than 3, do these 2 things, these 2 lines of code, right? So this is your while loop. Again, it looks simpler than a simple loop, right? The functionally it is the same. So it will start with count equal to 0, right? So CNT is 0. So while the value of count is less than 3, so count is 0, so it is less than 3. So do these 2, right? So it'll print hello and make the counter to be equal to 1. Again, go back, while the value of counter is less than 3, print hello, increment the counter. While the value of counter is less than 3, print hello, increment the counter. Now, when you try is the value of count less than 3? No, right? Because 3 is equal to 3. So now this condition fails. You will come out of the loop automatically. Right? So you can see hello has been printed 3 times. Again, if you want to control this, you will say num integer. And here, instead of checking for 3, you can check for num. Right? So let's add that. Here you will check for if you call while underscore loop, two times, right? So let's call this 3 times, right? And if you want it for 4 times, 5 times, whatever, right? So let's say 5, right? It will print hello 5 times. So these are the 3 ways of writing code repeatedly, right? Yeah, do you want to try this, or are you fine with the simple loop itself? Do you want to try this out?
Yes, ma'am. Please wait.
Okay. Harshali says done. Let's see. Deepak also has done. So okay. Yeah. So most people have done. So let's move on to the next topic, right? Which is that of exception handling, right? It could be a little, if you're not familiar with the concept, right? It could be a little complex, but let's try to follow. So what do we understand by exception handling?
To handle the error.
Rare errors.
Which errors? Yeah.
Yeah, that is like rare, not usual one. Something.
No, it's not like rare errors. exception is what you call a runtime error. Right? So while you are writing the code, everything seems okay. Right? But sometimes what will happen is while you keep, for example, something like a loop, for example, right? As you run the code, some data value might get changed. Right? So let us say you have some x by y. So you keep changing the value of y, and due to some data conditions, y becomes 0. If y becomes 0, you get an error called division by 0 error, because you cannot divide a number into 0 equal parts, right? So this is an error. This happens because at some point y became equal to 0. If y has the right values, then this is not an issue. So runtime errors happen when you are running the code. It is something you cannot, you can't handle it while you are writing the code. Right. So sometimes you see you are not allowed to compile the code itself. When you click on apply button, you will get a message saying something is wrong. So those are errors, right? So exceptions are errors that happen while the code is running, and mostly because of some data condition that has happened. So so whenever a program is running, right, you should make sure that it never stops abruptly. Ideally, your program will start executing from the first line. It will keep executing until it comes to the last line, right? And then your program ends. This is the proper execution. But sometimes what happens is something goes wrong, right? So let's say for this example, the value of y became 0 for some reason, right? So at that point, what will happen? Your program will stop abruptly. So this should not happen, right? So imagine you are using some app and suddenly it stops. It didn't give you a warning. It didn't say anything, right? It suddenly went blank. So that kind of applications you should not write. So what exception handling does is it gives you a way to handle exceptions that happen when it is executed, right? So instead of stopping abruptly, exception handling will allow you to take some action when this error happens, right? So take action when a specific exception happens, right? So we don't want the same action to be taken for all the exceptions. Depending upon what is going wrong, right? We need the ability to take action specific to that exception. So that is what your exception handling allows you to do. We don't want the program to stop abruptly. So it could be some fatal error, right? So where the program cannot continue. So even in that case, what you can do is you can at least give a message to the user saying something has gone wrong, we are shutting down, right? So that it doesn't all call, suddenly hang or suddenly stop executing. So every program, every well-written program should have an exception handling capacity, right? All languages give you this option. Most languages have this try and catch, right? Or in Python, you have try and except. So here also, we have the ability to write a block of code to handle any exception that happens within the procedure, right? So to understand how that happens, we need to see how MySQL has quantified these errors. So let's say you make some mistake, right? So when you're executing a code, let's say I say select star from a table that does not exist, right? We don't have a table called YYY. So you get something here. So this is called the error code. So this is called the error code. And this number that you see, this is called the SQL state. Right? So SQL state basically tells you the category, right? So what category of error it is. And this is the specific error that has happened within this category, right? So what they have done is they have tabulated all possible mistakes that or all possible things that can go wrong. And they have identified some 750 such scenarios. And each of these have been given an error code and a error condition. If you try to select a column that does not exist, right? So let's say select author name from authors. There is no such column called author name, right? So here you have a different error code, different SQL state, and the error is different, right? So this column does not exist. So like this, everything that can go wrong has been cataloged, and each and every error has been given a name, a number like this, and they have been put under different categories, right? So these errors belong to one category. These errors belong to the second category, right? These belong to the certain third category. So the category is represented as SQL state, and the actual errors are called error codes, right? So this error belongs to this category. Yeah. So these are the different categories of errors. So let's see what we have here. We got 1146, right? So it will be 1146 would be somewhere here. You can see from 1000 up to 1749, right? Totally 750 errors have been cataloged. So if you click on this, and let's go to 1146. So here you can see the error, the category, right? So if you look at just 3 errors before that, 434445, they all belong to this state. And this one belongs to a different SQL state, right? So these, if you look at the errors, right? Yeah. I'm sorry, just give me a moment. Okay, so if you look at these 3 errors, right? What is it saying? This says column access denied. This is illegal grant, grant wrong, right? So you can see all of these three errors belong to some permission related issue. Remember our grant and revoke, right? So this is for giving permissions. So these three errors, 443, 4445, belong to some kind of permission related errors, right? Although they are separate errors, they all belong to the same category, right? So all of them has happened because of some permission issue. Whereas this thing 1146 was something we typed wrong, right? So we are trying to access data from a table that does not exist. So that belongs to a second category, right? So this is how your errors are organized. Let me write it down. Deepak, I didn't get your question. Like, okay, so this is how it is organized. So you have the SQL state. Under each SQL state, there might be more error code. Sometimes there will be one error code, right? So this you can think of as the category, and this is the exact error. So if you want to handle an error, right, what you have to do is you have to first declare a handler. Declare a handler for the error. So the syntax for that would be, I would say declare some action handler for her error code. That is, if this particular error happens, what should you do? Right? So that is written between the begin and end. So this is what you call an exception handling block. Okay, so let's say you you want to handle this error called 1146. If somebody tries to give a table name that does not exist, right, you want to handle it, you will say declare this action can be either exit or continue, right? It could be one of these. Let me for the moment write continue. Continue handler, we'll see what is the difference between exit and continue. But for the moment, let's say declare continue handler for this error, right? So 1146. Begin, end, right? And here, let's say we are just giving a message saying select, check your table name, right? So let's write it, right? So that we can figure out how it is working. So we'll write a code, write the procedure, right? And we will make a mistake in our procedure. So come here, start, sorry. Create the procedure, call it accept underscore handle, right? And here, let's first write the procedure, right? And then we will write the code to handle the error in the procedure. So in our procedure, we'll have only one line of code, right? Or let's maybe add a couple of lines. So let me give a comment here and say procedure starts. Okay. So here, this is where our procedure begins. So let's say select procedure begins as message. Then we will say, we will make a mistake, right? We'll say select star from authors. Right, I've given triple S here, extra, and then select procedure ends as message. Okay, so now if I execute this, what will be the output? If I run this code, what do you expect to see? Can you all hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
The table does not exist.
We have a line before that also, no?
Right, yeah, procedure begins.
So it should say procedure begins. Then it will come to the second line, which is obviously a mistake. So it will do this, it will throw an error and it will stop.
Right,
So let's see that. This line will never get printed. So we'll say call. Right. It started, but then it gave this error and it did not continue. Right. So now let us write a handler to handle this. We don't want this abrupt termination. So instead we'll write the handler. So we'll say declare continue handler for what is the error? 1146. Right. And between begin and end, we will write what we want to do if this error happens. Right. So here we'll just give a message. Check your table. Now, what do you think will happen? What all will get printed?
Procedure begins, check your table name, and then procedure ends.
Yeah, that's right. So it will start as usual, right? And it will say procedure begins. But then when it comes to the second line, when it comes to this line, right? So this will raise an error. So when an error is raised, what MySQL will do is it will search the code, right? It will specifically raise the error 1146. It will search the code. Is there a handler to handle this particular error? If it is there, control will go into that block. So this will be printed, right? Then it has two options. One, it can stop executing here itself, or it can come back and continue with the remaining lines. So how does it make that decision? It will check this keyword. If you say continue, right? So this will be executed and then it will come back and continue with the next lines. And if you have the exit here, right? So instead of continue, if you had given exit here, it will execute this. Error is raised. Go here, execute this, but then it says exit, right? So it will stop here. This line will not be printed. Right, so let's try with continue, then we'll try with exit, and then you can try it out. Now the same procedure, right, we are calling. Procedure begins, check your table name, procedure ends, right? If I change this to exit handler, then procedure begins, check your table name, and that's all. It will not come here, okay? So, see, it says procedure begins, check your table name. Right. So what happens if there are multiple errors in your code? Then what you have to do? You can write multiple handlers. Right. So let's say you have this one. Select. So this is a different error, right? So 1054, where you are giving a wrong column name, right? So if that is also possible, then you can write a handler to handle that 1054 error, right? So you have to write a separate handler to handle 1054. And here you will say, check your column name, right? So let's say we pass a number here. And we will say if num is equal to 1, then do this. Otherwise, do this. Select wrong column. Else we'll say select author name from authors and end if. Right. So now what will happen is if I call this, right? So if I say call my proc, right? Sorry, what is it? Accept handle. Like call accept handle with 1, then it will come here. If I give any other number, it will come here, right? So if I call with 1, this will raise 1146 error. It will search the code. Is there a handler to handle 1146? So control will be transferred to this one. If I call it with 2, then this line of code will be executed. It will raise 1054 error. Again, it will search, right? Is there a handler to handle 1054? So this will be executed. And then because we have exit handler, it will say this and it will come out. So whenever an exception is raised, right, it will search, is there a handler to handle that particular exception? If it is there, control will go there. If it is not there, as usual, it will throw an error and it will come out. Okay, let's try this. Like close. And I call it 1, it will say check your table name. If I call with anything other than 1, it will say check your column name, right? It is going to the corresponding exception handler. So sometimes what you might want to do is, you might want to handle most of the errors with the same thing, right? You can't write exception handlers for each and every condition. So you will try to handle as many as possible, right? And the rest of it, what you can do is, you can give a general handler for SQL exception, right? So instead of this, I can make this SQL exception. Now also the behavior will be exactly the same, right? So what will happen? Here instead of column name, here you can say something went wrong. Something wrong. So now what it will do? It will search, right? So when it comes here, 1054 error will be raised. It will search the code if there is a handler for 1054. So because there is no handler, then it will search, is there a handler to handle the corresponding SQL state, right? So that is also not there. Then it will search, is there a handler to handle SQL exception? Then this will be caught by this. Okay, so this is how it searches. So if there are no specific handlers for an error, it will be caught by the general, this one, SQL exception, which is common to all exceptions. Okay. Are we fine with the flow of code? Any questions here? So now let us see an application for this, right? If you check your database, there is a table called payments. So at the moment, there is nothing inside it, right? And if you describe payments, you can see that it has only 2 columns, right? And the second column, which is called the amount, is a not null column, right? So if you look at the null, this thing, it says no, right? So this is a not null column. So that means you are not allowed to put null values into it. So if you try to insert a null value, right? Insert into payments, values, let's say 2 and some null. So this will give you an error, right? And the error that is thrown is 1048. So what we will do, we'll write a procedure to handle this error. So what is the purpose here? So if you see, you have a client ID. You have something called a client ID and the amount, right? So this is the table, and each client is expected to make some payment, right? So let's say some client tries to cheat by passing null for the amount. Instead of passing, typing a value, right? So let us say people try to keep the, sometimes it happens, right? So when you have a page like this, people don't enter all the values, right? So they will leave this null and they might press submit, right? So let's say somebody is trying to cheat us by not paying the amount. right? So they keep the amount as null. So what we can do is, because the table has amount as not null, right? So we will handle this exception and we'll keep track of who all are trying to cheat us. Okay. So what we will do, let's write a procedure, right? So which will enter a value into the payments table. Let's do that first, and then we will add the error handling part. So let us call it payments. Payments, right? So let us say this will take a client ID and also the amount. Both are integers, no? Yeah, both are integers. So let's say your procedure takes two parameters, amount, which is an integer. And here in the procedure begins, right? So here we will just say insert into payments values. Let's say client ID 1. So whatever client ID we are passing and the amount, right? So that needs to be inserted into our table, right? So let's see if this works. Let's write this first and then we will add the exception handling. So apply, close. So if you call payments, call payments with client ID 1 and let's say amount $700, then your procedure should work properly. And if you look in the payments table, right, you will see client ID has made a payment of $700, right? So this is what your procedure is expected to do. But sometimes what will happen, some people will try to insert a null value, right? So in that case, what will be the error that is thrown? If you try to insert a null, error number 1048 will be thrown. So what we want to do is we want to keep track of these people, right? So there is a table called fraud in your database. Here you have the ID, right? So this is auto increment. Then you have the client ID, right? So who's the client who's making this message? We will just say it is a fraud transaction and time of transaction will be right now, right? So what all should be inserted into this? This is automatically done. Client ID, the CID that we are passing. Message, we will just say fraud. And the time of transaction will be now, right? So if the error, where is that error? 1048 is raised, we want to insert into fraud, right? What all columns? Client ID, then message, and the time of transaction, values, CID, fraud, and time of transaction is right now, right? So what we will do, we will declare a handler. We will declare a continue handler for which error? Which error are we handling?
1048.
Yeah, for 1048, right? And between begin and end, we will add this. So what will happen is the person who is making the fraudulent transaction will never know, right, that it has failed. But then we are keeping track of who's doing the fraud. Can you write this? Write a handler to handle 1048. Inside that, you insert a record into fraud, right? And then here you can say payment completed, maybe, right? So here let us say select payment done. as message. Can you write a handler to do this? Write this and see if you are able to insert a record. Let me know when you are done. Is it done? Hello, people. Are you trying?
Yes, ma'am.
No, ma'am.
Well done.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so all we need to do is add a handler here, right? So we'll say declare, continue, handler for 1048, begin and end. And what do we want to do here? We want to insert a record. So we'll say insert into what was it? Fraud, no? Fraud. What were the columns? Client ID, message, and TOT. Client ID, message, and time of transaction, values. Client ID is the CID. And message, we will all say fraud transaction. And time of transaction is now. Okay, so this is what we wanted, right? So now let us try this. Okay, so let's make a proper payment first. So at the moment, there is nothing inside fraud. Select star from fraud. There's nothing inside this, right? So let's make a payment, right? So call payment. Client ID 2 makes a payment of $300. Right? So now if you check the payments table, 2 has made a payment of 300, right? There is nothing inside the fraud. Yeah, I'm sorry, we'll see this and we'll stop. Okay. Okay, so now if you check in the fraud table, nothing has gone inside, right? So now let's try to make a fraudulent payment. Let's say client ID 3 tries to make a null payment. This is something wrong.
Fraud details are getting
Ma'am.
into the fraud table, ma'am.
So what is wrong?
Fraudulent details are getting inserted into the table fraud.
Yeah.
While we are entering the details, it is just throwing us a error. But the details of fraudulent details are being recorded in the fraud table. If you check the fraud table,
I think we didn't handle the right error. Or what was the error for Fraud.
1248 was the error. Uh,
1048 is the error. So that is what we are handling.
Just why don't you check the fraud table once after making a fraudulent payment?
While making the payment only, it says,
Because in the fraud table, the details are being inserted.
no, for me, it didn't happen. Something,
Me, it happened, ma'am, with the same code. For me, the fraudulent payment details are getting recorded in the fraud table with a message fraud.
yeah, something here, I think, here it is giving me an error. Oh, this one. Okay, this is not MSG. That is message. That is fine. The column name is message. I gave it as MSG. That is a mistake. Apply. And now, not this one. So now let us try that payments 3 and null, right? It says payment done. But if you check the fraud table, there should be an entry into that. Right.
Yes, ma'am. There will be an entry in the table. Yeah.
There's an entry here. You won't see an entry in the payments table.
Yes.
Select star from payments, right? So you don't see an entry here. So if you make a proper payment, nothing happens. It goes into the payments table. But if you make a fraud transaction, right? So this is a proper payment which has gone into the payments table. Nothing went into frauds. But when you make a fraud transaction, right? So when you call 5 as making a null payment, then this the person making the payment doesn't know, right? But we are keeping track of what is being done, right? So the second fraud has been done by client 4 on this day and this time, right? So later on, you can do an analysis on the fraud table and you can find out what type of clients, what kind of fraud is being done, at what time of the day, how many times they are doing it, right? All those you can do an analysis by looking at the fraud table. Right, so this is how you can handle your exceptions and take some action based on the type of error that is happening, right? And as we saw, you can handle the exception at 3 levels, right? So you can handle it at the error code level, or you can handle the SQL state or the SQL exception. So every error comes under SQL exception category, right? So let's say we have written handlers to handle 1 or 2 exceptions. So if this happens, we want to take some action. If this happens, we want to take some action. Everything else, we just want to say something went wrong, right? So that can be handled using the SQL exception handler. So I hope you're fine with exception handling.